Breaking up without drama. Is it possible? I've always thought of myself as someone who avoids conflict. Not because I'm stronger or wiser, probably the opposite. I tend to choose silence over difficult conversations, hoping that with time things will somehow sort themselves out. With her, that became the problem. We hadn't been together for that long, but long enough for me to get attached. She was mature, calm, confident. Being with her didn't require pretending. And at some point, that scared me. I realized my feelings were changing, but instead of being honest about it, I decided to wait. I told myself it was temporary, that it was stress, work, a phase, that time would fix it. I was afraid to tell the truth and hurt her, so I ended up doing worse. I broke up with her over text. I'm ashamed to admit it now, but back then I just couldn't look her in the eyes. It took me almost 2 weeks to finally agree to talk to her in person. Last night, we finally met. I expected anger, accusations, a cold, tense conversation. And honestly, I was prepared for it. I knew I deserved it. But instead, she was calm. She didn't try to tear me apart with words. She didn't raise her voice. She just spoke honestly. About how much it hurt her. About how she would have preferred the truth earlier, even if it was painful. I could see that it wasn't easy for her, but she didn't turn the conversation into a battlefield. At one point, she said she was still grateful for what we'd shared. That she didn't regret the time we spent together. That I was part of her life, and she wasn't ashamed of that. It became hard to breathe. Because in that moment, I realized how dignified she was being, and how cowardly I had been. She told me she was proud to have been with me, that she had always accepted me as I was, with all my insecurities and doubts. She said it calmly, without drama, without trying to hurt me. That hit harder than any accusation could have. We said goodbye without tears or promises to talk again someday. We simply admitted, honestly, that our paths were going in different directions. When I left, I understood that the last memory she would have of me wouldn't be a fight or a painful scene, but a quiet, respectful ending. And that's probably the best outcome I could hope for after everything I did wrong. Sometimes ending things on good terms doesn't mean without mistakes. It means without hatred, without the need to hurt each other back, and with respect for something that once truly mattered. We broke up without any arguments. And that's exactly why it stayed with me more than anything else. We had been together for almost 3 years. Not perfectly, but honestly. Shared weekends, familiar routes, evening conversations where you already know what the other person is going to say, and still listen. The problem didn't appear all at once. It built up quietly. We talked about the future less and less, and about everyday details more and more. We didn't fight. It just felt like we were no longer moving in the same direction. One evening, we were sitting in the kitchen. Nothing special. Tea, an open window, street noise outside. I said that I felt like we were stuck. Not as an accusation, just as a fact. She didn't argue. She didn't shut down. She thought for a moment and said she felt the same way, but had been afraid to say it out loud for a long time. We talked for a long time. Quietly. Without sharp words. Each of us spoke about ourselves, not about what the other was doing wrong. About the fear of losing something familiar. About how sometimes love remains, but closeness doesn't. At some point, it became clear we didn't want to hurt each other by staying in a relationship that existed only because of the past. We didn't make the decision right away. We agreed to give ourselves time. A week. No promises. Just to observe how we felt. That week was strange. We were still living together, but more honestly. Without expectations. Without tension. And that's when I realized we had already broken up. We just hadn't said it out loud yet. On the last evening, we were sitting in the kitchen again. I asked if we felt relief. She nodded. We agreed to move out calmly. No dividing things, no petty arguments. We helped each other pack. I drove her to a friend's place. We hugged for a long time, not out of habit, but out of gratitude. We didn't block each other. We didn't have final conversations. We simply accepted that this chapter was over. Sometimes we texted later, kindly, without subtext, like people who wanted to preserve what had once been meaningful. I think about that breakup often. It didn't leave me with anger, only respect. And I understood one thing. Sometimes breaking up on good terms isn't a failure. It's a rare form of care when you let each other go in time, while you can still say thank you, instead of goodbye. Overall, I agree that it really depends on the situation. No two breakups are the same, even if the words sound similar. Last year, my wife told me she wanted a divorce. It wasn't completely unexpected, but it wasn't something I was prepared for either. We had tried for a long time to keep things together, talking, postponing difficult decisions. I loved her with my whole heart. Not out of habit, not because of the past, genuinely. When she said she wasn't happy anymore, I didn't feel angry. I was devastated, deeply. But I couldn't be angry at someone for being honest about their unhappiness. She didn't blame me or turn me into the enemy. She simply said she couldn't keep living like that. For me, it was crushing. I struggled for a long time. Not just because she left, but because the future I believed in disappeared. Still, there was no hatred. We separated calmly, with respect, with gratitude for what we had shared. In that situation, the feeling of guilt stayed with me for a long time. Not because I had done something wrong, but because losing someone you love is painful, even when it happens honestly. Then there was a very different experience. About a month and a half later, I started seeing someone new. Things moved quickly, maybe too quickly. I genuinely tried, but before long I realized I didn't see us being compatible in the long run. I didn't drag it out. I didn't disappear. I didn't give false hope. I told the truth. Her reaction couldn't have been more different. She exploded. She shouted, insulted me, accused me of being a terrible person. She said I had ruined everything, that I was selfish, that something was wrong with me. In the end, she told me never to contact her again. And strangely enough, in that moment, all my guilt disappeared instantly. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew I had been honest, careful, and respectful. And when you receive pure aggression in response to that, it's no longer your responsibility. That contrast taught me a lot. Sometimes a breakup is painful, but right. Other times it's loud and angry, but empty. And I realized one thing. Guilt exists where there is respect. And where there is none, all that's left is relief, because you told the truth in time. For a long time, I was convinced that I always chose the high road. The kind without shouting, without accusations, without scenes. I was proud of that. I truly believed that staying calm at the end of a relationship was a sign of maturity. I left quietly. I said I understood. I shook hands. I wished them well. And every time, I told myself I had done the right thing. But over time, I started to notice something strange. After those breakups, I didn't feel lighter. I felt heavier. On the outside, everything looked clean and respectful. But inside there was this lingering feeling that I had swallowed something important and never said it out loud. I realized that the anger always came later. Not during the conversation, but days or weeks afterward. When I replayed moments in my head, words, situations where I had allowed someone to treat me badly and stayed silent just to keep the peace. That's when I began to understand the value of anger. Not the kind that explodes and burns everything down, but a different kind. Controlled, grounded. The kind that isn't about attacking someone else, but about protecting yourself. The most ironic part is that I only learned how to be angry recently. It took me years to understand that anger isn't weakness or loss of control. It's a signal, a boundary, a reaction to something that was unacceptable. I used to confuse calmness with suppression. I thought that if I didn't raise my voice, everything was fine. But the truth was, I was avoiding conflict and paying for it with my self-respect. The first few breakups where I allowed myself to be angry were shocking. Not for the other person, for me. I noticed that when I'm angry, I become surprisingly clear. I don't ramble. I don't justify. I don't soften my words. I keep the conversation focused. I don't let it drift into manipulation or emotional fog. I talk about specific actions and the damage they caused me. These aren't the firework breakups people imagine, full of screaming, insults, and slammed doors. There's no chaos. It's a calm, firm conversation where I finally call things by their real names. My version of the high road doesn't look like quiet forgiveness anymore. Now it looks like honesty. I tell them plainly how their behavior affected my mental health and self-esteem. I don't humiliate them. I don't seek revenge. But I also don't dilute my words to make them comfortable. I don't ask for apologies. I don't wait for remorse. I ask for one thing only, that they stop and reflect before doing the same thing to someone else. Is that manipulative? Maybe a little. But for the first time, I walk away from those conversations not feeling empty, but steady, even grounded. I understand now why anger worked better for me than the nice, friendly approach. Because it rebuilt my sense of worth. Because there is real power in saying out loud, "You don't get to treat me like that." In the past, when I ended things too peacefully, I later felt ashamed. Not regret, shame. As if I had betrayed myself just to remain easy and understanding. That's no longer the case. I'm still not someone who seeks drama. I don't enjoy conflict. But I no longer confuse politeness with self-sacrifice. And maybe the most mature way to end a relationship isn't always about being kind. Sometimes it's about allowing yourself to be angry, naming what happened clearly, and walking away knowing you finally stood up for yourself. Exactly. Sometimes it's not anger or drama that breaks you. Sometimes it's silence. My ex didn't tell me she no longer wanted to be with me. She didn't explain. She didn't end things with words. Instead, she quietly erased herself from my life in technical ways. She bought a new phone. I didn't realize it right away. My messages just stopped going through. Then I found out she stopped using the number that was on my plan. After that, She changed her credit card, so shared subscriptions and charges couldn't go through anymore. And then she blocked me everywhere I could possibly reach her. No explanation. No conversation. No goodbye. At first, you tell yourself it's temporary, that they need space, that they'll cool off and talk eventually. You replay the last conversation over and over, trying to figure out where everything went wrong. Then days pass, weeks, and you realize you weren't paused, you were deleted. It took me over a year to get her out of my head, and even that wasn't a straight line, because every once in a while, she would reappear. Random messages, accidental encounters, half conversations that led nowhere. She would show up, and then disappear again for months. Every time, it felt like being pulled backward. I eventually understood that those interactions weren't for me. They served only her selfish needs, to reassure herself that she still had access to me, that I still thought about her. And every time, I paid for it with my mental health. It affected me deeply, not in a "I'm sad" way, much deeper than that. Constant anxiety, obsessive thoughts, a kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. My body was always tense, like I was waiting for something bad to happen. It's draining, mentally and physically. And the hardest part is that all of it could have been avoided. If she had just said, "I don't want to continue." If there had been one conversation, one clear ending, even if it had hurt, at least it would have made sense. Because of that, I couldn't date anyone for a long time. Not because I still loved her, but because there was no sense of closure. Like a door was left half open, and I couldn't move on. Only after the last of those encounters, after yet another sudden appearance and disappearance, did I finally start to recover. Slowly, unevenly, but for real. Now, for the first time in a long while, I feel like I can move forward. I've started talking to women on dating apps, not out of emptiness, not to escape the past, but because we genuinely share interests and values. And that feeling isn't happiness yet. It's relief. I realize something important. Sometimes the most damaging breakup isn't loud or dramatic. It's the one without words. And sometimes ending things on good terms isn't about a perfect farewell. It's about basic respect for another person's mental health. About not breaking someone who was only trying to understand what was happening. It's incredibly hard to behave with dignity when everything feels confusing and emotionally charged. When you're hurt, disappointed, or overwhelmed, dignity isn't the natural response. Impulse is. Most people react without thinking. They say things they can't take back. They try to protect their pride in ways that only make the situation messier. In 9 out of 10 cases, emotions take control and steer the conversation off a cliff. If you don't do that, if you pause, think, and choose your words, that already matters. Even if it doesn't change the outcome, at least you can look at yourself later and know you did what you could. I hope that brings some comfort, especially during moments that feel this heavy. I learned that lesson years ago, when I ended a relationship that had quietly run its course. Long before the conversation happened, I prepared for it. Not in a cold or calculating way, but because I knew how easily emotions could spiral. I wrote down what I needed to say. I practiced it out loud. I even thought about when to go and how long to stay, because I didn't want the conversation to drag on until it turned into something ugly. I went over the entire situation in my head, from the moment I would knock on the door to the moment I would leave. When I arrived at his apartment, I stayed calm. I didn't rush. I didn't over-explain. I said what I needed to say honestly, without attacking him or defending myself. He was disappointed. I could see it in his face. But he didn't lash out. He listened. He asked a few questions. He needed time to process, and I gave him space. At some point, he poured 2 glasses of wine. We sat there quietly for a moment, then raised them and toasted to the good parts. Not sarcastically, not bitterly, just acknowledging that, whatever else was true, something meaningful had existed between us. That moment stayed with me. Not because the breakup was painless, it wasn't, but because it never became cruel. I left knowing that I hadn't humiliated him, and I hadn't betrayed myself either. I hadn't acted out of fear or guilt. I hadn't said things just to soften the silence or ease my own discomfort. What I learned from that experience is this: preparation and grace don't erase pain, but they contain it. They keep a difficult moment from turning into lasting damage. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do, for yourself and for the other person, is to slow down, think things through, and show up with intention. It won't make everything okay, but it will let you walk away knowing you didn't lose yourself in the process. One thing I've learned the hard way is this: you have to let yourself feel what you actually feel, not what you think you should feel. For the longest time, I didn't do that. I thought I was being mature, rational. I believed that if I stayed calm, if I kept telling myself it's fine and it's not worth the energy, then I was handling things the right way. But I wasn't handling anything. I was avoiding it. If you're angry, you're angry. If you're hurt, you're hurt. And pretending otherwise doesn't make you stronger. It just pushes everything deeper. I spent a lot of time trying to talk myself out of emotions. I would replay situations in my head and explain to myself why I shouldn't feel that way, why it wasn't logical, why others had it worse, why I should just move on. All that did was make everything feel muted, gray, like I was existing without fully being present. The whatever, it's fine mindset is what kept me stuck for so long after my past relationships. I didn't want to feel heartbroken. I didn't want to feel angry. Those emotions felt embarrassing, inconvenient, too intense. So I buried them. I told myself it wasn't worth the effort, that I was above it, that I'd just keep going. And what I didn't realize at the time was that unprocessed emotions don't disappear, they just change form. My anger turned quiet. My sadness turned dull. And before I knew it, that numbness became a low-grade depression that sat with me for months. Nothing dramatic, just a constant heaviness, a lack of energy, a sense that something was off, even when things looked okay on the surface. It wasn't until I finally stopped resisting my feelings that things began to shift. I let myself be angry, without directing it at someone else. I let myself be sad, without trying to fix it immediately. I let disappointment, resentment, grief pass through me instead of pretending they weren't there. I didn't glorify the pain. I didn't drown in it either. I just allowed it to exist. And slowly, it moved on. That's the part people don't always tell you. Emotions pass when you let them finish their job, when you acknowledge them instead of fighting them. You don't have to justify your feelings. You don't have to minimize them. You don't have to be the bigger person every second. Feel it. Let it happen. Learn what it's telling you. And then, move forward, lighter than you were before. Ignoring pain doesn't make you resilient. Processing it does. After one particularly awful breakup, I did something I hadn't planned on doing at all. I wrote her a letter. The breakup itself had been messy, emotional. I said things I didn't fully mean. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I was overwhelmed and didn't know where to put everything I was feeling. By the time it was over, I was left with this uncomfortable mix of regret and unresolved emotion. So I wrote, not to reopen the wound, not to argue or defend myself, just to clear the air for both of us. The letter wasn't about blame. It wasn't a here's what you did wrong. It was mostly about the things I genuinely appreciated about her and about us. The good memories. The moments that still felt real, even after everything ended. It was strangely cathartic. There's something relieving about finally saying the kind things out loud, especially when the last interaction was tense or ugly. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for too long. I didn't expect anything in return. In fact, I didn't even care whether she responded. The point wasn't reconciliation. It was closure on my own terms. And here's the thing. Even if you end up feeling angry again later, even if time makes you realize you were hurt more deeply than you thought, it's still better when the last words you shared weren't cruel. A positive final exchange leaves space. Space for mutual respect. Space for friendship someday. Or maybe even something more, if life ever circles back around. And if it doesn't, that's fine too. Because even in the most cynical version of things, there's a small, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the other person sees you as someone who handled the ending well. Someone who didn't implode or lash out, but chose to end things with intention. Sometimes growth isn't about winning the breakup. It's about controlling the ending. You don't write the letter for them. You write it so the final version of yourself, the one they remember, is someone you can stand behind. And if, somewhere down the line, they realize just how well you moved on, well, that doesn't hurt either.